And a bad morning to y'all. We got late show today because I fucking overslept. I'm owning that completely. Also, we didn't do yesterday because something came up in my personal life. But basically, I think what that's gonna mean if it works for Daniel, which I guess I should have asked him before we got on, is whether or not 9 o'clock works. Pacific time works for Mondays for the next 2 weeks because that's pretty much my time frame. But whatever, we'll talk about that after we get off.
Fair enough.
Basic housekeeping. Um, this is brought to you by Brave, the ad resistant, track resistant browsing experience. It's also brought to you by the Cash App, dollar and Bitcoin wallet for your phone, and you can get a Visa card attached to that. It's also brought to you by Liberty Mugs, mugs that you can use to piss off your coworkers while also consuming fluid. So, on that note, let's pretty much jump into it. I think really the best thing to discuss right now is that senator's censorship bill. You had something on that? Hello.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just pulling up the article now.
Yeah, I gotcha.
This is from Reason.com, which, to be fair, is usually pretty good about this type of thing. This is by Elizabeth Nolan Brown. Senate Democrats are circulating plans for government takeover of the internet. Reason Roundup. All your base belong to us. A leaked memo circulating among Senate Democrats contains a host of bonkers authoritarian proposals for regulating digital platforms. Purportedly as a way to get tough on Russian bots and fake news. To save Americans' trust in, quote, our institutions, democracy, free press, and markets, it suggests we need unprecedented and undemocratic government intervention into online press and markets, including comprehensive GDPR-like data protection legislation of the sort enacted in the EU, which, for reference, is an absolute shit show if you have to live there and deal with it on a regular basis. That's from me. Titled, quote, Potential Policy Proposals for Regulation of Social Media and Technology Firms, the draft policy paper, penned by Senator Mark Warner, leaked by an unknown source to Axios. The paper starts out by noting that Russians have long spread disinformation, including when, quote, the Soviets tried to spread fake news denigrating Martin Luther King. He fails to mention that Americans in charge at the time did the same thing. But now it's different because technology. Today's tools seem almost built for Russian disinformation techniques, Warner opines. And the ones to come, he assures, will be even worse. Here's how Warner suggests we deal. Mandatory location verification. The paper suggests forcing social media platforms to authenticate and disclose the geographic origin of all user accounts and posts. Mandatory identity verification. The paper suggests forcing social media and tech platforms to authenticate user identities and allow only, quote, authentic accounts. Inauthentic accounts not only pose a threat to our democratic process, but undermine the integrity of digital markets. With, quote, failure to appropriately address inauthentic account activity, punishable as, quote, a violation of both SEC disclosure rules and or Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commissions Act. So they are actively now trying to fight one of my suggested strategies for taking on these companies, which is to provide disinformation for their algorithms so they can't make money off of you. Bot labeling. Warner's paper suggests forcing companies to somehow label bots or be penalized. No word from Warner on how this is remotely feasible. Define popular tech as, quote, essential facilities. This would be subject to all sorts of heightened rules and controls, says the paper, offering Google Maps as an example of the kinds of apps or platforms that might count. The law would not mandate that a dominant provider offer the service for free, writes Warner. Rather, it would be required to offer it on a reasonable and non-discriminatory terms provided by the government. Other proposals include more disclosure requirements for online political speech, more spending to counter supposed cybersecurity threats, more funding for the Federal Trade Commission, a requirement that companies' algorithms can be audited by the feds, and this data shared with universities and others, and a requirement of interoperability between dominant platforms. The paper also suggests making it a rule that tech platforms above a certain size must turn over internal data and processes to, quote, independent public interest researchers so they can identify, quote, public health and addiction effects, anti-competitive behavior, radicalization, scams, user-propagated misinformation, and harassment, data that could be used to, quote, inform actions by regulators or Congress. And of course, these include further revisions to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, recently amended by Congress to exclude protections for prostitution-related content. A revision to Section 230 could provide the ability for users to demand takedowns of certain sorts of content and hold platforms liable if they don't abide, it says, while admitting that attempting to distinguish between true disinformation and legitimate satire could prove difficult. The proposals in the paper are wide-ranging and in some cases even politically impossible, and raise almost as many questions as they try to answer, suggests Matthew Ingram, putting it very mildly at Columbia's Journalism Review. Free markets. Telemedicine, abortion. So that's basically the complete bit with regards to the government's attempts at takeover. There's a number of other pieces around free market information, because this is the roundup section of Reason. So they do, I think, one of these weekly, and they give a number of news articles. But that was the main one I wanted to highlight in particular, given its implications from the news that happened last night. I believe, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was yesterday. But like, okay, so just to preface this, I'm not a cunt. So I'm gonna bring up an article that's like, because I was gonna reference this as well, but it's good that somebody posted an article in the comments for the post I made on Facebook, because this isn't just exclusive to Alex Jones, who we will be talking about, but it's also this sort of social media crackdown happens to anybody who questions the narrative, like for any length of time. And in terms of Twitter, there are several prominent libertarians who were suppressed yesterday because they dared to go against basically a New York Times dick polisher. So we're dealing with people who are fundamentally evil and who will protect their own. So I'm going to read this article that you sent from the Gateway Pundit on InfoWars, and we can get into that a little bit. But after that, after we go into the ramifications of the censorship bill, and then I'm going to prove that it's not just Alex Jones who's a target. It's anybody who goes against the narrative by reading this article from ZeroHedge.com about the accounts that got suspended or barred or suppressed because essentially they were calling an idiot an idiot.
Why don't you start with that one, mate? Because I think Alex Jones is going to have to be a bit of a main event for us on today's channel.
That makes sense.
Let's get the little fry out of the way to make the case why censorship is fucking retarded, and then explain what Alex Jones should be doing.
So the article is entitled "The Crackdown Continues. Twitter Suspends Libertarian Accounts, Including Ron Paul Institute Director." One day after what appeared to be a coordinated attack by media giants Facebook, Apple, Spotify, and Google on Alex Jones, whose various social media accounts were banned or suspended in a matter of hours, the crackdown against alternative media figures continued as several libertarian figures, including the Ron Paul Institute director, found their Twitter accounts suspended. Justin Raimondo posts 2 more casualties of the Twitter purge of anti-war voices. Scott Horton Show and the new editorial director of antiwar.com, and Daniel L. McAdams, director of the Ron Paul Institute, are you next? And antiwar.com says Scott Horton, Peter Van Buren, and Dan McAdams has been suspended from Twitter. If you go to their accounts, you will see their old tweets, but they're prohibited from making new tweets. They were reported by Cats on Earth for criticizing his posts. Please complain to Twitter. The article goes on, says, Horton was reportedly disciplined for use of improper language against journalist Jonathan M. Katz, he said in a brief statement, while McAdams was suspended for retweeting him, he said. Past tweets in both accounts were available to the public at the time of the writing, unlike the account of Van Buren, which was fully suspended. According to Target Liberty, Horton and McAdams fell victim of Twitter's suspension algorithm after objecting to Katz's quarrel with Van Buren over an earlier interview. The suspensions come days after Twitter suspended Black conservative Candace Owen from Twitter for highlighting the algorithmic hypocrisy of Twitter by replacing the word white with Jewish in a series of tweets modeled on those by New York Times editor Sarah Jeong. Just after controversial conservative Alex Jones and his podcast InfoWars were kicked out from most social media platforms, prompting conservatives to accuse the social networks of collusion in a collective crackdown on non-mainstream voices. The Silicon Valley giants were criticized by the U.S. political establishment for failing to prevent alleged Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. Meanwhile, critics now say that pressured media giants are engaging in political censorship using their market dominance and lack of legislated neutrality requirements to target fucking misspelled the word dissent voices ahead of the main midterm elections. In a scathing op-ed on Tuesday, Nigel Farage wrote that while many on the libertarian right and within the conservative movement have their issues with Alex Jones and InfoWars, this week's announcement by YouTube, Facebook, Apple, and Spotify represents a concerted effort of prescription and censorship that could just as soon see any of us confined to the dustbin of social media history. These platforms that claim to be open and in favor of free speech are now routinely targeting, whether by human intervention or not, the views and expressions of conservatives and anti-globalists. This is why they no longer even fit the bill of, quote, platforms. They are publishers in the same way we regard news outlets as publishers. They may use more machine learning and automation, but their systems clearly take editorial positions. We need to hold them to account in the same way we do any other publisher. Farage then accused social media giants of being corporatist, that they cannot profess to be neutral, open platforms while being illiberal, dictatorial, and hiding behind the visage of a private corporation, which are more often than not in bed with governments around the world at the very highest levels. This isn't capitalism, it's corporatism, end quote. He concludes that the real interference in, quote, U.S. democracy comes from not from Russia, but from some of its most powerful corporations, which now yield more power in some cases than the government itself. He says this isn't liberal democracy as they keep pretending, it's autocracy. For those that don't take issue with the latest censorship of right-wingers by social media, unless we take a stand now, who knows where it could end. Now, I disagree with the way that Zero Hedge ended that article because it, you know, fucking Scott Horton's not a right-winger by any stretch of the imagination, and neither is Daniel McAdams. Peter is the closest, but he's still not there. Whatever, though. That's an issue I could quibble with, but at the same time, that's the reason I wanted to bring this up, too, because I'm not enough of a cunt to say that that it's a conservative-only issue.
No, and I'm not enough of a fool to think that it only happens in the West or in America. Because I picked up another article. Just to let you know, guys, we decided this should be censorship reporting day. Because this is mainly because of the Alex Jones story. But this is from Africa, part of DeutscheWelle.com. Or Vel even probably. Internet censorship in Africa threatens democracy economy. Many African governments have taken to censoring a variety of apps and sites, especially around election time. Does that ring a bell for anybody right now? But people across the continent are increasingly seeking out ways to work around the blocks. At first I thought my cell phone had been hacked or something was broken, said a DW correspondent who reported from Mali about last Sunday's presidential elections. Social networks were suddenly unavailable. In many African countries, this is almost par for the course in the days leading up to the elections. Critical websites suddenly go offline, communication apps send error messages. According to the organization Internet Without Borders, ISF, this was also the case during Mali's presidential election. ISF relies on data from an international observatory that checks the regional accessibility of certain websites and apps several times a day. According to this data, WhatsApp and Twitter, among other apps and sites, were not available for several hours on election night. It was suspected that the sites were closed on the orders of the government. But African internet users not only struggle with temporary shutdowns around elections or during large demonstrations. Government agencies in countries such as Rwanda, Uganda, and Cameroon routinely censor certain online content. Blacklist, deletions, and intimidation. There are a couple of ways to block and filter online content, says Mai Truong, a network expert at US-based non-governmental organization Freedom House. But unlike China, which is considered the world leader in internet censorship, no African country has the technical means to monitor the entire internet. In sub-Saharan Africa, we see that the authorities often direct the internet service providers, ISPs, to block or blacklist of URLs, Truong explains, thus blocking certain websites at the provider level. This is particularly successful where the internet providers are state-owned or have close ties to the government. According to studies by the University of St. Gallen, Switzerland, this is the case in several states in sub-Saharan Africa. According to Truong, authorities are more often resort to a less technical form of censorship, the deletion of previously published content. The police coerce website operators into removing critical text and comments, says Truong. Those who do not cooperate are threatened with legal consequences. This leads to a climate of fear and self-censorship, which is what it also does in Britain, by the way, because that's what I have to do. Government are also increasingly trying to make use of online services and social media more difficult generally. Uganda, for example, introduced a social media tax at the beginning of July. Since then, access to apps such as Facebook or WhatsApp has only been available to those who pay around 50 cents per day to their internet provider. Online barriers harm the economy. The official line is that the government has imposed this tax because it wants to raise low tax revenues. But Lillian Nawuga believes that the real purpose of the tax cannot be overlooked. The director of the Ugandan branch of the Internet Society, an international group of activists, says the way the tax was introduced, with the president saying that it would help him more or less silencing or curbing online gossip, that is already curtailing free speech. Now, Woga warns that the measures such as the social media tax will primarily affect poor and less technologically oriented people. For many Ugandans, social media is the first point of contact with the internet, she explains. So anyone taxing them would therefore exclude many potential new users from getting online, which means being excluded from free access to information. Small businesses for whom Facebook, WhatsApp, and other social media are important marketing channels are particularly affected, says Nawona. If it continues to be implemented, we are afraid it's going to have a chilling effect on the internet industry in Uganda. How users circumvent censorship. So this is the big important bit for everybody here. There are ways to avoid internet censorship, for example, via virtual private network or VPN. VPN creates a tunnel to the outside world, and it allows internet users to surf as if they were in a country without restrictions, says Truong. It is true that many governments are now increasingly taking action against VPN, Truong explains, but the good news is VPNs are very versatile, and many new VPN companies are currently emerging in response to censorship, he says. VPNs are essentially a tool that creates a tunnel to the outside world for users to surf the internet as if they're in a country without restrictions. Truong explains more and more. We are actually seeing governments catching on to the use of VPNs, but the good news is VPNs are versatile, and there are many VPN companies that are created in response to censorship. Don't know why they repeated that twice, but hi. We no longer get people coming in to ask us how to use these platforms, but instead they're asking us, how do I install VPN? This is another reason why many governments are increasingly relying on stricter laws. Officially, it is in order to better combat cybercrime, but a recently introduced law in Sudan, for example, also makes government-critical comments on social media punishable, says Truong. That's the main trend we are seeing, a lot of new laws trying to regulate social media and online criticism in particular. So it's not just us that this is happening to. Truong is also concerned that large parts of Africa's internet structure is provided by Chinese companies such as Huawei and ZTE, the same companies whose technologies also make possible China's, quote, Great Firewall. However, there is enormous concern that some African governments want to cooperate with Chinese companies to install similar technologies in their countries, Truong reports. But there are also positive developments. For example, according to Truong, the situation with previous censorship pioneers, Gambia and Ethiopia, has improved considerably in recent months. He says that the change of government in both countries has led to a more open environment for the internet. New leaders in both of these countries have actually unblocked a lot of content that was previously blocked. However, there are still restrictive laws, especially in Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, citizens are waiting for the new leadership to overturn the harsh laws and make sure that they can't be used against citizens in the future. And that's from Jan Philip Willem. And I just wanted to highlight that before we start going into the meat and dirt of what's coming up in a second, because it isn't just America. It isn't just Britain. This censorship is a problem that is slowly happening everywhere. In some places, it's been going on long before it's been tried again in the West, but it's being tried on a global scale, and it needs to be combated on a global scale.
Right. Well, and people need to stop being fucking cunts because, like, okay, so whenever I bring up the fact that a social media thing is censoring people, people first bring up the fact that it's not censorship because it's not government, which is bullshit. Because most social media platforms either get money from governments, like Twitter getting its Saudi money or Facebook getting CIA money, or fucking, or they're fucking literally a government outlet like Facebook, which has been proven time and time again to be a front for the CIA's keyhole firm and essentially an info mining firm for every major intelligence organization out there, including the Five Eyes of global intelligence, constantly getting information and data for like everybody around the world that people voluntarily provide. You know,
yeah, just so that they can comment on a cat photo.
Yeah, and B, that they're a quote private company, the most cunt of cunt things to say, because essentially what you're saying is that because they're a business, they're not beholden to any sort of ethical or scrutinous like norms. You can't criticize them because they're a private business. It's like a shield to these people. Well, bullshit. Fuck you. It's a private business, sure, even though they're publicly traded. But that doesn't mean shit to whether or not people should criticize them, especially since eventually this will be the platform, the primary platform for words getting into people's ears. And if you don't look at it that way, then you don't see what's coming. And all the sci-fi movies warned you, but to deaf ears. So fucking cunts. You were going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of things. First off, there's a great new hat that I saw in the same sort of style as Make America Great Again that says, Make Orwell Fiction Again. I really think everybody needs to start buying that fucking hat and just wearing it around everywhere to remind people Orwell was a cautionary tale with 1984, not a fucking blueprint. This is not how people are healthily able to live in a society. It was a dissertation on how a dystopia can be formed if thought becomes penalized as a crime. But on top of that, I mean, I would have agreed to some extent with those people saying that it's a private company, they have rules and regulations, and if you violate those rules, it's a problem. However, there's certain terms in those rules that are not defined. There are certain concepts in those rules that are very vague. And when you have a vague set of rules to deal with, the discretion does not go to the company. It goes to whomever is violating those rules.
Right. You know, and let me be real fucking specific here. Hate speech isn't real. No. It's not fucking real. You can't have a policy based on something that's not fucking real. And the primary thing here is that if you have a hate speech thing, and then you say like, you know, it's for protected race, gender, blah, blah. And then you have countless people operating on the platform criticizing whatever is in power, quote, because effectively prejudice plus power is the lying narrative that everybody's trying to push for anything ending in ism.
Yeah.
The effect of that is that only certain people are allowed to do hate speech. And then all you have to do is prove that somebody is being hateful in a specific way, And then you can say, well, they're obviously being hateful because of this person's X, instead of acknowledging what they're saying, the toxicity they're in. And when you have platforms so constantly cucked out to basically the mainstream narratives, so that they can still operate on college campuses without being blocked like certain other platforms have been, and that so that they don't lose that huge market share, it's going to change the way those platforms allow and mediate certain information to come through them. Their algorithms will be written, for instance, to and we'll talk about that Candace Owens thing after we're done with the Alex Jones thing, where effectively certain words are barred, and certain other words are not, and it's totally arbitrary.
Well, it's not technically arbitrary. It's just slanted with extreme bias. It's arbitrary from our perspective. From their perspective, it's quite straightforward. If you aren't left-leaning radical, you ain't allowed to talk. It's simple as that. If you aren't a left-leaning radical, you can't speak on those platforms.
I would say it's a little like it's less than that. It's more that they'll give you like a shorter leash.
They won't even give you a leash in some cases, mate. If you say something pro-Christian
on Twitter,
well, give it time.
Well, that's what I'm saying. So he'll get yanked back, but only when he hits the end of his relatively short leash, and he hasn't done that yet. So
Not yet.
I'm saying that you can talk. I don't want to be alarmist. I do want to be specific.
For now, that I will agree, you can talk. If we don't start fighting back against this, I don't see that happening for much longer. But let's hit up the main story for today. I think at the moment, I'm pulling this off a Life site because it was the least biased one I could find off a Life site news, and it's more biased towards truth on this one than anything else. This is by Claire Sheraton. Published, I think, Monday at 1 p.m. August 6, 2018. In the latest clash between big tech companies and those who hold unpopular or controversial views, Facebook has permanently kicked, quote, InfoWars off of its platform, saying that the page was, quote, unpublished for using hate speech. Facebook's banning of Alex Jones' signature platform came just after Apple removed almost all of his podcasts because, quote, Apple does not tolerate hate speech. We believe in representing a wide range of views so long as people are respectful to those with differing opinions, as Apple spokesman said. Spotify also removed Alex Jones' show from its podcast. YouTube deleted the Alex Jones channel on Monday morning. It had nearly 2.5 million subscribers. What we are witnessing is an ideological purge intended to redefine the very concept of free speech, InfoWars editor-at-large Paul Joseph Watson wrote. If free speech does not include controversial, unpopular, offensive speech, it doesn't exist. A society in which free speech doesn't exist is doomed to collapse into authoritarianism. Although InfoWars promotes some conspiracy theories that are far outside the mainstream, for example, that 9/11 was orchestrated by the U.S. government, it also reports on current events just as other media do. During his presidential campaign, then-candidate Donald Trump granted a video interview to InfoWars. Watson called the mass deletion of InfoWars from Facebook, Apple, Spotify, and YouTube a coordinated purge and political censorship. WikiLeaks came to InfoWars' defense, asking which publisher in the world with millions of subscribers is next to be wiped out for cultural transgression. This is the tweet from the WikiLeaks channel. The Empire Strikes Back. Apple, Spotify, Facebook, Google, YouTube, all purge InfoWars' Alex Jones. Yes, InfoWars has frequent nonsense, but also has a state power critique. Which publisher in the world with millions of subscribers is next to be wiped out for cultural transgression? And then it shows a picture of Paul Joseph Watson's tweet, followed by InfoWars says it has been banned by Facebook for unspecified hate speech. Regardless of the facts in this case, the ability of Facebook to censor rival publishers is a global antitrust problem, which, along with San Francisco cultural imperialism, reduces political diversity. Facebook said in a press release the deleted InfoWars pages were taken down for, quote, glorifying violence, which violates our graphic violence policy, and using, quote, dehumanizing language to describe people who are transgender, Muslim, and immigrants, which violates our hate speech policies. Molly Hemingway of The Federalist wondered on Twitter if Facebook will censor Planned Parenthood to be consistent about opposing those who glorify violence and dehumanizing others in order to justify violence. This is MZ Hemingway's tweet. Just curious, did they also ban Planned Parenthood to be consistent about opposing those who glorify violence? Because I'll be honest, the reasons they gave was just ridiculous as far as I'm concerned. The source material came from somebody who was known to have lied in the past about InfoWars, had been proven to be false about that information, but we'll get to that in a bit. Many conservatives argue that Facebook and Google essentially have monopolies on distributing and sharing of information and are using these monopolies to unfairly target certain viewpoints for censorship. When Facebook banned Alex Jones' personal account for 30 days last month, Senator Ted Cruz asked who the hell made Facebook the arbiter of political speech. Ted Cruz: I am no fan of Jones. Among other things, he has habitually repeated slandering my dad by falsely and absurdly accusing him of killing JFK. But who the hell made Facebook the arbiter of free speech? Free speech includes views you disagree with. #1A. Mark Dice's response: Alex Jones is now an unperson straight out of the plot of George Orwell's 1984. Regardless of what you think of him and InfoWars, this is the equivalent of digital book burning and sets a horrific precedent for mass censorship by big tech. The ban is just part of a wider censorship purge that is also using stealth censorship, shadow banning, and algorithmic manipulation to hide and bury conservative content, Watson wrote in another post. This is the modern day of electronic equivalent of book burning. So yeah, basically, Alex Jones is now is persona non grata on every major social network, and I don't see this ending well for Google or YouTube or Facebook or Spotify, really, to a great extent. They're getting rid of content. Sorry, go ahead.
And to be very specific, fuck all the people who said that I was wrong about this, because I've been saying this is going to happen for years, and everybody's like, no, they'll never do it. They want the ad money. They don't want the ad money. They want ad money from a very specific stock of people so that everything is milquetoast enough that nobody's going to delete their account or get off the thing. So and I've been saying that for years. They're going to start cracking down. They're going to start enforcing a very strict viewpoint set, and they're going to start fucking with people very, very specifically for what they do.
Well, part of the problem I have with all of this, and I got into looking at antitrust law because I got a bit concerned over the fact that all of this happened within a 12-hour period practically. 4 major companies completely blacklisted one of their business partners. Now, that is effectively what the arrangement was between InfoWars and all of these other companies. They had some terms of engagement that they had with them. They created content. They provided advertisers something to sell their content against. And Google would have reaped a large amount of money off of the content that they allowed on their site. Same for Facebook. Same for all of these people. Then they decided to basically hamstring themselves with the adpocalypse and a number of other solutions. Now they've decided we don't even want to try to make money off of this because it pisses off the activists we listen to too much. That is the only explanation I've got for it. And it's not going to end well because of the Sherman Act. Now, this is a piece of legislation that's been in place since 1890, and it's been put in place to prevent things like price fixing, bid rigging, market allocation schemes, and basically criminalize monopolization of a service. The fact of the matter is these social networks have lockstep agreed to cut down content, and that does imply some level of collusion. It may not be direct, but it is definitely, just due to the timing, something that can be easily implied and considered as a possibility. It could definitely be done a subpoena could definitely be then raised with basically probable cause to on all of the email communications between any of those companies. And there will be some, because Spotify works off of Google's Android systems and Facebook as well. There is no reason to presume that these people don't talk to each other because they have to work on each other's platforms. This is very straightforward law that if somebody tries to provide an unfair benefit to, like, keep a certain set of companies in charge, that's collusion, and that's illegal under the law. It's antitrust law. Same thing's true if one group works on the benefit of another market to eliminate a competitor. That's another form of collusion. That's also illegal. These are major SEC sort of crimes. These are sorts of things that can get people, I think, put in prison if you violate enough of them over time. And the way that they're going, it's as if they don't seem to even know. It's as if they've basically told their legal team, fuck that noise, we're going to do what we want, and it's your job to make sure it never comes to light, rather than advising us to be within the law.
Well, right, and just before anybody, decries us as no longer anarchist or whatever, these motherfuckers are state entities practically. They get huge amount of money from the states. They get huge amounts of contracts from the states. They're practically a globalist institution at this point. And if you look at it properly, they're a money laundering firm for government intel agencies. So yeah, fuck them. They're getting a taste of their own poison right now, and their poison that they've always bottled as medicine is going right down their throat, and I hope they get deep-dicked.
Now, if somebody makes that argument to me, A, too woke, it doesn't matter, and B, more importantly, I'm arguing what is. I'm not arguing what ought to be. I'm arguing what is today. Now, if you want to use purely anarchic solutions, abandon all hope, ye who enter Facebook, Twitter, or Google's accounts. Use every other provider out there. There's DTube, BitChute, Vimeo, Dailymotion, LiveLeak. There are a number of other websites out there that provide video content apart from YouTube. YouTube's just the Pareto monopoly. If you abandon YouTube completely, then you will not, or they will not be able to make money off of you. They will not be able to survive as an entity, and they will die for their crimes if you see them as such.
Well,
that's the argument.
If you're going to use Google, just use it to expose intelligence as much as you can, because effectively, the more and the more people who are directly informed of the evils of the intelligence agencies, the less power those agencies will have to begin with, and the less it will matter whether or not their intelligentsia outlets, effectively their Pravda, are fucking powerful or not.
Precisely, and that's one of the reasons.
And that's by the way, that's why it matters that Daniel McAdams, Pete Van Buren, and Scott Horton were all fucked with by Twitter. Because if you look at it properly, they've been constantly going after the intelligence and military-industrial complexes for a really fucking long time now, and they're proof that these platforms got a bias against them, because essentially they didn't break Twitter rules at all. They just said some rude things to somebody who is already being rude and who's a fucking NYT cuck. Like, basically, he's written for every major left-wing outlet out there, and
precisely. Why do you think Mark Warner wants that law passed?
Well, right, but and then, like, if you look at it, his primary outlet has been the New York Times, and he spent like a grip of time yesterday around this whole thing, defending the New York Times in the face of memories of them lying us into war. So, yeah, fuck this guy. I hope he loses everything.
Well, one thing I will say as well on top of that is there are other ways to fight back against these companies. If you're on Facebook, send an email to anybody you actually really care about who's also on Facebook, just letting them know that you're changing a lot of details on your Facebook account because you disagree with Facebook policies and you don't want them making money off of you properly.
Or just use the tools that they give you to mine all of the email addresses from your Facebook contact list through a Yahoo server and basically fuck them anyway.
Yeah, either way, tell them this solution. Basically, change your profile to be somebody you aren't. If you're a little white woman, make sure that you're a young black man. That kind of principle. Set all of your settings to something that that is a lie. If you do that on a regular, or just stop using the platform like I've pretty much done. If you do all that, then any advertising that is sold to you is going to be sold effectively incorrectly. And you can just constantly flag the algorithm and say, nope, this isn't for me. This is nothing I'm interested in. I don't want to see this ad. I don't want to see this ad. They get enough of those kinds of notifications coming back. They'll assume their algorithms are breaking, and they'll have to make modifications to them. In the meantime, they will lose money. If they lose money at the moment, that is going to be a major problem for them because they have lost user base levels. The stock prices collapsed. They're currently going through at least 2 that I've found class action lawsuits for this 20% stock slump. And as on top of that, an SEC investigation into insider trading as Facebook employees, including Mark Zuckerberg, sold a shit ton of stock right before everything collapsed and may have contributed to it. But this is the problem. If Facebook has been weathering an 18-month scandal-ridden storm of shit, and somehow Wall Street is still saying buy, but that will change. It isn't tenable to keep things going like this. The only reason why they're saying buy at the moment is the algorithm works. If you attack the algorithm, if you make it so that little old ladies are being analyzed as an entirely different demographic group, the main purpose of Facebook, branding, will go away. And this is, just to let you know, this is coming from effectively an insider perspective on the ad industry, because that's how it works for Facebook. Their main source of revenue is branding. They want an audience to see their stuff. If they start seeing new audiences, all of a sudden, people will be really happy to begin with, and then when they see those audiences aren't real, they will bitch and moan about fraud. And they will bitch and moan about being stolen from. This is something that Facebook will not be able to weather alongside everything else that they're having to weather. This is a game killer for them.
Well, you know, I mean, and I see where you're coming from there. I have a slightly different strategy, which is to overload the network with truth. And if you do this properly, there are mechanisms in Facebook that allow you to directly contact people. For instance, I tagged 100 people in the post talking about this episode of Bad Morning News. I said, you know, we're starting a little late, but we're still going to go. Again, apologies for the oversleep audience and Daniel.
Right,
but the general idea that I have is don't let their algorithm do the talking for you. And this is not an idea original or exclusive to me either. The MAGAists, for instance, are very, very fucking good at it, because what they'll do is they'll make big-ass MAGA follow trains from certain accounts with like tens of thousands of followers, and then those people will post their good tweets in response to those follow trains. If the anarchist community had something equivalent, we could fuck some shit up.
To be fair, there are some communities around, for libertarians at least, that does have some effect. It's a little bit harder for anarchists because we don't really like agreeing to rules unless they're very well defined. And if they're not very well defined, they tend to be more it tends to be, well, you're just going to do exactly the same as everybody else, so why should I join you? What benefit does it give me? What have you done for me lately, as Eddie Murphy would have said?
and that's why, like, if anybody wants to subscribe to another podcast, which, obviously the kind of person who subscribes to podcasts is generally the kind of person who would already have thousands in their feed. But if you want to stack another one on there, Free Man Beyond the Wall with Mance Raider is actually reasonably good.
Yeah.
And he had me on recently to discuss anarcho-coalitionism, which is my idea of basically anarchists finding enough common ground that even if they're not that type of anarchist, they'll work with one another. And I have a decent amount of people
voluntarism.
Well, I mean, except it's not, because voluntarism as a movement, sort of like feminism as a movement, is defined by the fact that most of them are cunts these days who don't want equal rights but just want increased privileges. Voluntarism
I wouldn't go that far.
I would. The bulk of voluntarists would identify themselves as ANCAPs, or at least as right libertarians. And if you look at voluntarism and the logos and everything, they're all yellow and black, which is the reason why I made my head red for this, to fuck with those people. So the general vibe of voluntarism is a very specific sort of thing. It's not any sort of voluntary thing. It's right-wing ideology that is also libertarian. And so if you just say you're a voluntarist, that comes with very specific connotations. My bent here is that I don't care what you call yourself, as long as we have similar goals to take down the state and you're genuinely interested in either minimizing or ending it, I'll work with you. That's what anarcho-coalitionism is. It's building a coalition of anarchists, not saying that you have to call yourself voluntarist or I won't work with you. You just have to call yourself anarchist.
Okay, from my perspective, an anarcho-coalitionist is effectively a voluntarist in its true definition, which is, as long as it's voluntary, it's okay. So I don't care if an anarcho-communist and a group of anarcho-communists want to get together and form a commune. And if they want to do business with me, I'll be happy to sell them shit. But I ain't gonna go any further than that, because I'm not really willing to live in a commune. I'd rather have capitalism be my economic model to live by. But that's just me. I'm not going to force that onto people. But if they want to take advantage of my goods, they're going to have to buy on my price terms, not on theirs. Or we'll have to negotiate, just like any voluntarist should do. It's a fairly simple premise that I will agree tends to attract ANCAPs mostly, simply because it is in perfect logical alignment with that philosophy. But at the same time, we don't think that communists have to be capitalists. We don't think syndicalists have to be libertarians. We don't think any of that sort of stuff. We just think if you want to work with me, you have to agree to the terms I set out for you. If you don't want to agree to those terms, then I'm sorry, I'm not going to work with you.
Which is why I like anarcho-coalitionism, because it means that as long as you're moving in the direction of anarchy, I will work with you. I might not, generally frequent your specific establishment because I only have so much money, but I'll definitely work with you in your efforts to do X, Y, and Z. I find a huge deal in common with many anarcho-communists in terms of drugs, foreign policy, war, police statism, the intelligentsia apparatus, and corporatism. And I can use that and my, having read left-wing philosophy to talk to these people. I can talk to these people because I'm willing to hear them out, but a lot of people aren't, and because of that, we're going to fucking lose, because anarchists aren't willing to talk to one another, and they're instantly polarized by their biases. And I disagree with that approach strongly, very strongly.
I can understand that. It's not good to get polarized by your biases. You can't learn anything from that. And I don't disagree with that in the slightest. I do question some of the other branches of anarchy simply because I don't see the logic to some of their claims. But that's a different discussion and much further down the line from censorship. And at the moment, I'm not really that worried about the communists getting censored, because right now, their doctrine seems to be gospel, or at least the Marxist
Well,
side of that doctrine seems to be
well,
gospel, if I want to
mhm.
be accurate.
I mean, no, though, because again, conservatives aren't the only ones getting blocked and banned. And I don't think that the huge amount of either centrist, libertarian, or left leaning people who have been kicked off as well are just sacrificial lambs. I think there's enough of them to make a data set.
Oh yeah, I'll agree with you on that, but that's just because the Overton window has moved so far left that you can't even see it from the center with a telescope.
Well, or
It's
maybe it's the fact that,
insane.
or maybe it's the fact that there's a decent amount of people on the left who have their own Overton window, and the majority of people are starting to see that window for what it is. So the right has to move their Overton window. I mean, we've agreed on previous casts that these are two heads on the same bird. So we have to also acknowledge the fact that the left and right aren't fundamentally that different or that adversarial to one another.
From a political perspective, you are correct. From a social perspective, it has been engineered so that that conflict exists in quite a heavy-duty totality.
Oh,
And
well,
the
yeah,
left
but
at the left at the moment has quite a large stranglehold on what data is made available to the rest of the world. So that then aids those countries in being able to justify their arguments for imposing hate speech laws like they've done over here in Britain.
Right, and if, by the way, anyone wants to check out an interesting stream, we had an interesting stream on Shit Shooting Sunday this last Sunday talking about digital prepping, so feel free to check that out.
To be fair, it did descend into physical prepping quite a bit.
Well, you know, and I think that the physical prepping one will also end up hitting on a lot of digital prepping, because our digital lives are on the extension. It's like a peripheral of our physical lives. So I do think that they're going to have some overlap there, and I'll bring up some overlap just to make sure that we have all their bases covered this Sunday. We're going to have a part 2. We're going to go over physical prepping, but I think a good article to round off this this particular episode with is on activistpost.com. And it's by Stefan Gleason. It says, "Will unapproved opinions be censored off the internet?" And this is before his YouTube channel was completely taken down. Alex's, he says, "False opinions are like false money, struck first of all by guilty men and thereafter circulated by honest people who perpetuate the crime without knowing what they're doing." Joseph de Musser. You wouldn't be reading this if you didn't value alternative points of view. After all, you could have easily clicked your mouse right now to CNBC, CNN, or the New York Times for conventional news and opinion. The fact that you have the slightest ability to bypass big media's biased filters makes them and their ideological allies furious. Some members of Congress who clearly don't like the spirit of the First Amendment are working with internet gatekeepers at Google, Facebook, Twitter, and Apple, now a trillion-dollar corporation, to try and prevent you from accessing information they haven't approved. Silicon Valley executives recently appeared before Congress, where several representatives called for big tech to implement more aggressive restrictions on hate speech and conspiracy theories. Those are in quotes. Shortly thereafter, one of their main targets, alternative media personality Alex Jones, had his Facebook account suspended, multiple videos removed from YouTube, and podcasts deleted from streaming services. Has Jones made some controversial claims over the years? Sure. But he has also hosted top-notch experts on his program who are willing to speak inconvenient truths about our monetary system, about market manipulation, and about the globalist agenda. Among his guests have been Gerald Calente and Jim Rickards, both of whom have appeared multiple times on Muddy Metals podcast, former Congressman Ron Paul, and even Donald Trump early in his presidential run. It's pretty safe to say that Donald Trump would never have become GOP nominee Trump, let alone President Trump, without the sizable backing he got on alternative media and social media platforms. Now, many of his supporters are being deplatformed and shadow banned by social media CEOs who were in the bag for Hillary Clinton. This is only a preview of what's to come in the event that big tech and big media titans help install a new congressional majority this fall, and perhaps a new president in 2020. Once our free and open internet could become as centrally controlled and censored as it is in communist China. Yes, we will still have the First Amendment, but members of Congress have discovered a convenient end run around it. They can just outsource whatever they want, censored to the tiny handful of corporations that control 98% of the internet. It's already happening. Radical Representative Keith Ellison last month fired off a letter to Amazon. He demanded the giant online retailer remove items from independent sellers that are perfectly legal to sell, but that he personally finds offensive. Among the offending items was a historically accurate Georgia state flag flown from 1956 to 2001. History is now hate speech. It won't be long before the perpetually offended demand that Google searches for Krugerrands, first minted during South African apartheid, return links to the Southern Poverty Law Center. Any analysis that questions the official version of a politically sensitive issue is a conspiracy theory. No sharing on Facebook without a trigger warning placed by Team Zuck. Any suggestion that precious metals markets are manipulated by central banks and governments could be deemed too edgy for social media. The whistleblowers at the Gold Antitrust Action Committee have been deemed too edgy for CNBC, after all. The so-called mainstream media has been relentlessly pushing its own conspiracy theories about unproven Russian Putin-Trump connections, relentlessly pushing fake news stories about Trump-inspired approved opinions were allowed to be posted. If you prefer a free and open internet, then be sure to support independent content creators and platforms.
The bile in my throat at the moment. It is quite painful. Right. To people like Sarah Jean, when you say things like that, think of what you are doing to little 10-year-old boys and whatnot who don't know why, for whatever reason you consider it, white men are so evil or white people are so evil. Because they're now thinking, if they have to read that they are inherently bad. And one of two things will happen. Either they will then become very depressed or they will behave inherently bad. It is either the self-fulfilling prophecy solution or the guilt solution that you're imposing on them. And there are no other alternatives apart from anger at you being wrong. And to promote this vile putrescence as being progressivism is it's a profanity to the people who actually had the civil rights movement, who only wanted to be treated as equal, not to be made equal.
To be fair, and this is something that Martin Luther King Jr.'s estate would definitely approve of me saying, a lot of the people involved in the civil rights movement wanted more than that, and they wanted social justice, not just, a platform of supporting the I have a dream middle of this speech, but like the beginning of it too, where he's talking about social inequalities and the fact that the nation has been led incorrectly. I mean, everybody likes to talk about the middle of this speech, but nobody likes to talk about the parts where he's basically being a political radical. And he lost relevance later on in life, so much so that the Boondocks, that popular cartoon, made an episode about how if Martin Luther King Jr. were still alive, he'd be signing books in a mall with nobody interested. So
I'd agree. He's slipped into largely irrelevance because a lot of the message that he had behind what he was trying to say seems to have been lost either by one side or the other.
But it's not just that it was lost, it's that it was actively suppressed by COINTELPRO and by the fact that essentially he was approved by much of the mainstream establishment whites. His message of peaceful resistance rather than fighting back against bigotry violently like somebody like X was something that they wanted. It was something to basically insulate from consequence from the society that they had built. Or more adequately, gotten built by other people and then claimed ownership over. And when King started to speak out on political issues instead of just as many people would consider it cooning and hollering, when he started to speak out on issues of a far leftist concern, saying that capitalism had problems and that the church should be the headlights of global policy, not the taillights, not just following in the footsteps, but actually making things happen so that the world is more Christian. then he was censored. And then when he eventually didn't shut the fuck up and just do what he was told, he got assassinated.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean,
who wouldn't know?
If you speak out too loudly and make too much noise, that's what happens, unfortunately, in the modern American world. But yeah, I mean, from my perspective, there was a need for it in the 70s to get at least some parity going, to make it so that it wasn't possible to consider X group of people inferior because of Y trait, for example. Be it because you're a woman, or because of your race, or because of your sexual orientation, whatever the reason may be, there's been quite a large amount of activity that has been done to basically equalize opportunity. The problem is that the left in particular isn't happy with just equal opportunity anymore. I would have been quite happy with equal opportunity, because then at least it's on my own merit that I'm able to succeed or not based on whose father went to what country club.
Right.
Which is how it is for most major professions or trying to get into, shall we say, the exclusive CEO club. Either you are an unbelievable innovator or you're part of the old boys network. One or the other, there's not really many other ways in. And it's the old trope of if you work hard and you can climb your way through the ranks. It doesn't work unless you're willing to play politics all the way, and some of us aren't. For those of us who aren't, either you're a member of the old boys network if you're a CEO, or you're an unbelievable innovator if you're a CEO. And there's no real other way to become one, from what I've seen in my short experience on this world.
So before we wrap this up, because we are going to have to do that relatively soon.
No.
We have some comments that I want to talk about. So first off, we got Finian saying, "Don't forget, Swiss National Bank owns a ton of Facebook and Apple." Yes,
so
they absolutely do.
So do the Saudis. They own a lot of Facebook, Twitter, and I don't know about Alphabet, to be fair, but they do own like a 30% stake, I think, in Twitter.
Yeah. Well, and Paulo LaRue says this might be a test. If they can actually remove InfoWars, then a lot of people are next. I agree, 100%.
Definitely.
Danielle Hatfield, your mother, says,
"That'd be my mom.
I am QFD banned on Twitter, and it suppresses my number of followers too." Yes, yeah, and people. Okay, so I got into a massive argument recently with somebody. I don't know if you saw that, because
I don't tweet.
Me there. Well, no, I'm speaking to her because she follows me over there. But this guy was insisting shadow banning is just conservative propaganda and that it doesn't happen. Let me grab some water real quick. But it absolutely does. It's happened to me like 3 times, and it happens fucking regularly. And people who don't believe that it happens have just never had it happen to them so that they can watch it happen live. It's really, really sad, to be honest.
Confirmation bias. People don't want to believe something bad happens that from a group that they approve of because they approve of it.
Right. And Finian says they don't need ad money. They exist to replace TV programming. As soon as people stopped watching TV, alternative ways to control them had to be created. Enter social media. That's like us all being on G+ before. Doesn't help. We will always be a tiny minority to the systems, and we won't have much effect on the algorithms. Best solution is walk away. Only reason I'm on Facebook right now is to see the pictures of my wife shares of the kids, etc. And Danielle says, I never joined it. That's all really good information.
I mean, from my perspective, I only ever use Facebook for similar reasons why Finian does. I only got one because I basically did it as I think it was a birthday present for my wife. It was the only thing she asked me to get for her, and I got put in a box here, people. So I just use it to communicate with people I actually have met in real life. If I haven't met you, you're not going to be on there. And the only person I think I've really made an exception for on that are people in specific people that I know in Google Plus.
Right.
And that's only because I've known them for several years online in another network.
Right.
And I'm not adverse to knowing them. But that's beside the point. I don't really use it that much. My activity is zilch on there. And it's, again, only when people mention me that I will do anything on Facebook whatsoever, which is why I don't really consider it part of my network portfolio. I focus on Minds and Steam and Discord because those are the ones that work for me.
So, and then Finian goes into it and says, what if, and this is something I've thought for a really long time, what if the purpose isn't ad money, but instead government propaganda and programming? Make people perfect little nationalists, affect elections, make people pro-war, etc. Danielle says, or communists. And Finian continues, this reminds me of the recently leaked Google presentation. The stated objective of Google is to use herd mentality to redirect masses of people to do and believe certain things. And Danielle says their propaganda is ubiquitous anyway. For propaganda, you mean?
Yeah, and to be fair, he's absolutely right. A lot of this is... Do not... Look at the timing of this, everyone, please. Because this is very well timed, given the fact that there are midterms coming up in just a few months. This has massively limited one of the major conservative news outlets from being able to communicate with its following. So there is less ability for them to know what's going on. They're now limited basically just to Fox News or the InfoWars app, which if anybody is a fan of InfoWars, I do recommend you download it. It's currently more popular than CNN's apps or anybody else in the mainstream media's apps. I wonder why. As long as it's still allowed on the Google Play network,
well, and
then
even when
it's still going
APIs
to work.
Are downloadable. Like, people forget your phone is a computer, and you can install whatever you want on your own computer.
Precisely. And you can rootkit the rest of it if you want to get an app in from a non-standardized source. It is possible. Some phones even allow you to set those settings up.
Oh, well, and you can get apps from non-standard sources anyway, as long as they're in API format. Or APK format, sorry. Fucking...
Yeah, that's the one. I was like, API doesn't sound right.
Yeah, no. Because I've been talking a lot lately about API for some fucking reason, and fucking it's on my brain.
The interface, not a kernel.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so on that level of censorship, it appears this show was censored for part of the show. And if you look at the comments, it says, where is it? Something broke, Finian says. This video is unavailable after it got all choppy. Danielle Hatfield says, okay, the broadcast just cut out. Apollo LaRue says, they got Jeremiah. No. Finian says, I hope it switches to dlive.io. And I will be, by the way, switching relatively soon. I'm thinking next Monday is when we roll out streaming to multiple platforms at once. So
we'll try and keep a presence on YouTube as long as they allow us to stay here.
Oh yeah, well, and I'll keep doing YouTube, but that's the thing. It's going to be streaming from an Nginx server on my Alienware that I just got. Thank you, Finian, by the way. And he says YouTube blows. Apollo says refresh, and Finian says done. And apparently, refreshing work for everybody here. So
that's good.
I guess
it was a bug.
Well, but I guess everybody had to refresh it once, and I guess they're suppressing me now. And they're suppressing you. They're suppressing this information. That's interesting. I'm not going to jump saying that it's active for a good, like, for specific things. But what I do know is that they undergo active processing of the audio for whatever videos these are, and make sure that nothing is being said. Because effectively, if you look into how their content filtering happens, and whether or not something is considered advertiser friendly, what happens is they'll process the audio, and then they'll like listen to that processed audio in massive quotes with speech to text system that they use for captions, but then they'll analyze that text file for anything suspicious, and they'll keep it going, which is why so many of those creepy channels using children's characters in suggestive ways and things like that get to go on as much as they do, because they don't have words going on, just music. So the effective...
There's another one that they can do as well with closed captioning if you're not careful. They did this to Secure Team 10. I actually saw the video. Somebody sent it back to them and put the captioning on. And basically at the end of the video, he was saying goodbye to everybody. And the last words, according to the captions, were, motherfucker. And he never actually said those words at all. And basically it was like, it was just ridiculous. It was like, you could see this bit of added text. It's like, anybody who was deaf is now thinking he's swearing at them for some obscure reason.
Yeah.
I mean, they can add data to it, and they will do if the system is programmed in a certain way to do so.
Yeah.
Remember, all this is algorithmic.
and Danielle says sometimes the glitch is just a glitch. And I agree, and I'm not just going to automatically assume we're being targeted, but it is suspiciously timed, because I don't think that issue has ever come up on this stream before. So,
not before
like
now.
that specific issue.
Might have been because I suggested suing the companies that are currently hosting this platform for what they've done to Alex Jones, either the federal government doing so or a class action from all of his subscribers. That might be an interesting one to pursue.
Yeah.
See if there's some sort of violation of terms of service for removing your favorite content.
Yeah,
arbitrarily.
And tomorrow, when we start Bad Morning News, I'll give people a report on whether post-processing the video has any issues. Because if they fucked with this stream, I'm going to be fucking furious.
Yeah, we had enough problems trying to get this one going today. Let's make sure they don't mess it up in the process.
Well, especially if they're targeting me. If you're listening, fuck you. Eat my ass.
I'm not going to go that far, but yeah, fuck you too. Honestly, I'm not happy with any of Google's work so far. They've been treating their customers like shit. They've been treating a lot of their products as abandonware. And I will quite happily lambast them because, to be quite frank, I'm on Android, so I'm a bit limited in what I can really use, and I'm getting sick to death of finding out whether or not it's Google approved.
Yeah. Well, and it doesn't matter logically whether it's Google approved or not, but people have this herd mentality bullshit where they'll just accept it because it's Google approved. And, you know, honestly, let me just fucking bring up an article that people should read in full. But let me just say this to wrap this up. This is from the Free Thought Project. Former Education Secretary admits U.S. students are failing because education system, quote, runs on lies. We're not top 10 in anything, said a former Education Secretary who's calling out politician for creating a public education system that, quote, runs on lies. Typically, when Americans hear someone say that the education system in the U.S. runs on lies, they would expect the statement to come from a disgruntled parent or student. But now it is coming from the former Secretary of Education, as he admits that the U.S. lies to families on a daily basis by promising them a quality education through public schools. Arne Duncan, who served as Education Secretary for the Obama administration, now appears to be calling out all sides of the spectrum for failing to prioritize the next generation. In an interview with CBS's Face the Nation, Duncan argued that politicians are never held accountable for failing students and teachers. We say, this is his quote, and I'll basically leave it after these two paragraphs. We say we value education, but we never vote on education. We never hold politicians accountable, local, state, or national level, for getting better results. Higher graduation rates, more people graduating from college, Duncan said. We say we value teachers, but we don't pay teachers. We don't support them. We don't mentor them. And the way that they need to do their incredibly important, tough, complex work. As a nation, we're not top 10 in anything, Duncan said, and he has a solid point. The U.S. Department of Education released a troubling set of statistics in May, which showed that the majority of 8th graders in public schools are not proficient in reading or basic math.
Jesus.
According to a report from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, only 34% of 8th grade students in American public schools were proficient in maths in 2017. That number varied by state, where proficiency rates as high as 50% in Massachusetts and as low as 17% in Louisiana. The reading report from NAEP revealed that last year only 36% of 8th grade students in American public schools were proficient in reading. That number also varied by state, with proficiency rates as high as 49% in Massachusetts and as low as 24% in New Mexico. Duncan also noted that the U.S. has raised a generation of young people and teens who have been raised on mass shootings and gun violence. While he said that the U.S. is set apart from other countries because it does not value its teachers and its students through funding or care, he is one of many government officials to claim that the answer can be found in new gun control legislation. However, Duncan did not address the fact that many of the suspects in school shootings struggled with depression and anxiety and were prescribed powerful addictive psychotropic drugs that came packed with a host of dangerous side effects, including aggression, violence, and suicidal tendencies. Duncan also did not mention that a significant portion of the violence that is seen in public schools is perpetuated by the same individuals who are tasked with keeping students safe, the school resource officers who are stationed on campus. It goes into it a little bit more, and I recommend everybody read the article. But basically, every student out there these days is being trained to accept authority, but is not being given any good reason to.
No, and they're not being trained to actually question in any way authority or question in any way what they are told. They're being basically told what to think, not how to think. Yeah. It's the worst thing one can do as a teacher, unfortunately, do that. And to the teachers in America, I actually do feel for you, or at least some of you at least. It depends on your field. But there are incentives in teaching which are perverse. I remember hearing a teacher explain in a deposition once that he had a Class A student, basically, all-star, had top-line scores on all of her tests. And obviously he taught her how to achieve that much. However, because she was so successful, the system required her to score better than the maximum score possible on the next test that she had, or else the teacher would be penalized for that student. That's fucking perverse. There's no way to justify that, to penalize people for having really good, top-quality students because they can't improve further because the tests don't score that high.
Yeah.
It's insane. Meanwhile, you've got other kids who basically, and there is, to be quite frank, there is a form of racial segregation when it comes to public schools because it's all geographically based. And there are large geographic regions, especially after all the gerrymandering that's been going on by both parties in order to make each region more beneficial to whoever's in charge at that time. That gerrymandering affects the school districts. So you get school districts that have less funding because of who's in them. And that funding then means that they get less supplies. And funnily enough, the ones that have less funding are the poor income communities to begin with. So by gerrymandering to try and keep their districts Democrat, they wind up also deprivileging, in a way, all of their constituents because they've changed the map layout. And that district will get less money because it's contributing less to the budget. It's insane. Meanwhile, the rich and powerful are getting everything that they could ever want, but they're not using the public school system because any of them who have thought ahead will be putting people in the private system. Just like my family, or my mother did, again, thank you very much, and did so by basically sacrificing heavily on her retirement. Well, it's the only reason I got the education I got.
And like, let's be real specific. the private schools generally don't teach about class inequality. They generally, like, I don't, if correct me if I'm wrong, but I doubt your particular school went very hard in the paint for the lower classes.
You actually would be a little bit wrong there, because it was a very balanced education. It was a very different kind of education. It wasn't the standard. There was some basic things that had to be taught, like any school, but it was more of a point counterpoint kind of style of education. I had to read Thomas Paine. I had to write out the Constitution and things like that.
Well,
but at the same time, I also had to, as part of the English Lit courses, read a lot of literature written by people like Malcolm X, by people who were affected by racial circumstances, quite a large number of, shall we say, classical texts that were involved in that. I didn't have to read Marx, but there was a wide range of, shall we say, information on the poor, on Christianity, on any number of subjects that I could, basically on my own volition take based on my interests. There were some things you had to take, but there were other things you could do alongside those that filled whatever credits you had. It was basically sort of a pre-college system, because it was all credit-based by the time you got into high school.
Right. And and let me be specific. We got a few comments to go over, and then we'll have to go out because we already
we're already well over.
Well, whatever. We were being suppressed, so we need extra time.
Yeah.
Finian says something that I would pretty much say here. Not all private schools are equal, and the reason I'm saying that is because yours sounds like it's a fundamentally different case to a decent amount of the private school educated people that I've come into contact with, because a lot of those people are in bubbles. They think that the world is a certain way, and it's not. And I'm not sure.
I agree with you. No, I agree with you. I saw that happen in particular within a few years. It was basically up to a certain point. I mean, don't get me wrong. I was basically I was scholarship boy. So effectively, to a large extent as well, from the first few years I was there. So there was an elitist attitude for a few years, to be fair. But that changed over time. Yeah. However, it came back very, very quickly when, by the senior year, I started noticing it in the year, not the freshman, but the year below the freshman. They had this sense of entitlement that confused the hell out of me, because it was basically, because my father is this, I'm the most important thing on this planet. Right. And if you don't agree with me, then there's something intrinsically wrong with you.
Or just get tossed.
Yeah. But to be fair, by that point in time, there were people that they would have learned very quickly freshman year, probably, that kind of behavior will not be tolerated by upperclassmen. Or at least one would hope that's what they would learn very quickly, because reciprocity can be a real bitch to people. And they were basically top grade below high school, so they had the sense of we're graduating into this upper sect, and they didn't realize that means you got an even bigger hurdle to get across, not that you've completed the end goal. And it's like that cartoon where you've got the kid who screams, "Yes, I've conquered high school. Nothing can take me down. I've beaten you. You'll never beat me again." And then behind him, you've got college, and then jobs, basically waiting with a massive club, and then taxes.
Yeah.
Looking like a hollow out of Bleach.
Oh, I don't watch that. Should I?
It has its good points. If you get into it, it's quite fun. But I won't say that it's like a particular anarchic anime. But it is.
In terms of anarchy, I've heard that I should watch Death Note, and I'm open to
Oh
doing
yes,
that.
Death Note is excellent. It's more for nihilism than anarchy,
I think they're
but
the same thing. If nothing
there,
matters,
there
then you're
are
not intrinsically tied
overlaps.
to a state power.
There are overlaps between the two, I'd say. I wouldn't say they're the same because you don't. If you're a nihilist, you're basically quite willing and happy to watch the whole world burn. You don't have to be that if you're an anarchist.
Well, you don't have to be happy to watch the world burn to be a nihilist. Anybody who's read Nietzsche can tell you that, but you know, but a separate issue. We'll talk about that some other point. Also, Danielle says, question much of anything, really. It's indoctrination.education, to which I responded, indoctrication, lol. So, and then we've got some questions about your education. And it says, what is it? Where is the thing? So did they teach you fucking logic, economics,
yes,
spatial reasoning?
Well, not. It was more logic was taught to me in mathematics. So when we were learning geometry, we were forced to learn how to logically prove that geometry was true. And then learnt the philosophy of mathematics, which is basically nothing is mathematically sound unless you can logically prove it is true. And once you have logically proved it is true, it is true. It is never false. Yeah. It will only be false unless the falsifiable conditions are met.
And so a Popper.
Yeah, a Popper sort of solution. And there are basically some situations where you cannot prove things, and there are other situations where you can categorically prove things if X, Y, Z variables exist.
Right.
So it's like SAS, and there are all sorts of abbreviations for those things, but we learned very quickly how important logic was for mathematics. We also were one of, at the time, we had a computer science department, and this is a good, 20 years ago, mate. So it was fairly high end. When the Xbox came out, they were using it as a server. So it was one of those sorts of situations. They had a very good comp sci teacher there.
And to move on, Finian says a lot of private schools are actually religious indoctrination camps. So instead of government as the religion, it's a Catholic school or some other.
To be fair, that may be true for Catholic schools. Mine was Episcopalian, to be honest. So there was a religious undertone, and there were religious studies, but they didn't just teach Christianity. They also taught. I didn't have this because I was a chorister. But everybody else who wasn't a chorister had to take a religious course, which taught things like all the holy books, not just Christianity. You had had all the Hindu books as well. I don't know I can't remember the names off the top of my head, but all of those. There were entire tests around those specifically. So there was quite a wide faith acceptance at that school, even though there was a weekly little sermon. And every year there was a sermon on when Christ's birth actually was, because it wasn't when everybody thinks it is. It was something like 4 AD in April kind of thing, because that's when the celestial event actually happened.
Right. Well, okay, so to get to the other comments here, Finian says, there's no reason for the old model of schooling these days with the internet the way it is. Children should be unschooled, taught online, and then do trade schools, perhaps for skills that would require them. Danielle says, homeschooling is also a good alternative. Finian says, my oldest left high school early, went straight to college. My 3 others will skip high school entirely and go straight to college. I wish I didn't have a hamster wheel to run on, and I'd homeschool them. Danielle says it's buffering now and it's straightened out, so fucking thing. By the way, we have 5 people in this chat, but YouTube still shows 2 watching now on my screen. Mine shows 5. More suppression.
Statistic suppression is another brilliant way of managing network control. If you
they
honestly
might not want me monetized.
Yeah, they don't want people to. They don't want alternative views shared if it's going to limit their capabilities in the long run. They have a strategy, and they are banking on it working, and they are
Right.
doubling down on it.
Right. Gregory
It's never
Spillane
good to double down on a fail.
Gregory Spillane says, "My kids are homeschooled, and I'm very proud. I have 4 on my view count." Okay, so if you want to help this, there's a feature on Facebook to tag up to 100 people. If you tag up to 100 people with this video and get them to watch it, which I would be very grateful if you did, we would be able to crack this suppression anyway. And I would absolutely appreciate anybody who wanted to do that. If you're on Twitter, you can tag people in a post and just make sure you tag them with the video, because most people won't click outside of a post. And just share it wherever you can. Share it in your circles on Google Plus. Tag everyone in a Discord server, because it looks like we're being suppressed. That's fucking nuts.
It's annoying as hell. And to be honest, if it's not just us who's going to be suppressed, if anybody out there who wants information and wants people to know things, don't rely on these companies anymore. You can't. If you want this stuff out there, if you want people to know what you know and what data you've been getting so that your reality is what it is today, you have got to share it with them directly.
Yes.
If you have to do that privately or publicly, it doesn't matter, but mention people, identify people in your network that have huge shares and get them to try and reshare it. It works really well.
And Finian says 11K followers, public posts, and no one saw my contests on content on Google Plus. Total joke. Danielle says, I'm only allowed to follow like one more person on Twitter, but I'm already following you. Thank you, by the way. Fucking yeah, we're being suppressed. Jesus Christ, there's very little thing that I have that I couldn't use to say that we're being suppressed now. It's happened like 3 or 4 times in this one video. That's insane.
It's not surprising me in the slightest. I expected to be to be honest, I expected to be cut off at some point in the stream, like we were with that with Claire. During all of those NWO ones.
But at the same time, like I expected this to happen, but not at this stage. I didn't think they'd be frightened at 530 subscribers.
Mate, they're frightened by anybody because it has gotten to this is why they banned Alex Jones. He was the canary in the coal mine for all of the free independent thinkers on YouTube because he was that little bit crazy that everybody went, I'm not sure you got the right end of the stick here, mate, but we like your style kind of thing.
Yeah.
And because he had such a following, it was very hard to get rid of him. Now that they've gotten rid of him, we're all up for grabs. We're the easy targets now. He was the hard one. If they can keep him off, if they can keep his followers from kicking up a stink, then that's when you'll start seeing the likes of Sargon, Paul Joseph Watson, Milo, even Jordan Peterson, and us being completely taken offline and depersoned from the mainstream. And I perfectly expect it, and I'm not going to be happy about it by any stretch of the imagination, but that's why I'm on Minds and Discord and not on Facebook and Twitter. I'm not relying on those systems because I know they will fuck me.
Yeah, and that's the thing people need to realize is that if we don't get diversify your portfolio here, treat it like a portfolio and diversify it and get everywhere. Fuck them up because you can.
Make sure that
it's much more powerful than you think you are.
Oh, definitely. I mean, get your content on BitChute, on DTube, on any other network that will take it. And make sure it's one that actually has free speech and decentralization built into its concept, like BitChute, for example. I mean, it's built on a peer-to-peer network. So if one node is shut down, there's another 15 that probably have the data. So you can at least reclaim your videos, which is something I doubt Alex will be able to do off of Google.
Right. And I think a good way to wrap up this stream, and I'll pretty much stop the broadcast right after, you know, and I hope everybody here shares it with a huge amount of people, because I'd say that it's pretty conclusive evidence of suppression. This doesn't normally happen. And the day that we're talking about censorship, this starts happening.
You talk about censorship, you get censored.
Yeah. I think I don't want to be alarmist. I really fucking don't, but it does seem like that.
I wouldn't put it past them, mate. I may need to. I was going to start off reality talking, but I think narrative crafting may wind up needing to be my first set of personal videos, because this is getting this is getting ridiculous now. What the amount that they are now going into Hail Mary endgame strategies to try and craft narratives, and it will not work. The information will still get out there, and
Right.
Fox News will still exist, and InfoWars will still have a website, unless they get the DNS shut down. So
I'll finish this out with the thing that I posted last night and somebody's response to it. I made this fake Yu-Gi-Oh card that says they're a private business, and it has a guy in a nice shiny business suit, and it says using this. It's from the Not and Argue set, so I thought I just put that in there because it's funny. And the little reference number at the bottom left is like information about the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. But because it's a fake card, I can do what the fuck I want. They're a private business. Using this allows you to absolve a business whose practices are being called into question of any guilt or responsibility for their actions, no matter what effects are on the field. This counter may only be used after a business is questioned, and only if the user believes it cannot be countered by anything.
Love it.
I thought it was pretty good.
It's fucking brilliant. No, that wasn't us.
Yeah. And 422 guy SSS says, "Sorry, but I'm a libertarian, not an anarchist. I can't support a handful of tech companies with biases having a monopoly on speech in the modern era. Same way we regulate big utility companies and such, service being suddenly denied from them is disastrous," which is the fucking point I was making. But Hannah Wallen, who I tagged in that tweet, says, and she's with the Honey Badger Radio, a great anti-feminist and men's rights activist radio thing. She says, "What really needs to happen is careful consideration. Isn't it odd that these companies are so publicly playing their 'look at us, we as world dominating powers' card? They want regulation. They want the government telling people what they can and can't say online. They also want legislation they can point to and use as an excuse to censor. It'll be called something counter to what it does, like the Online Freedom of Speech Act or something. But if it's pushed for by these giants, it'll give them the power to determine what is or is not legitimate political speech and legitimate news based on their own criteria. It'll also be designed somehow to hinder the growth of alternative media, alternative social networking, and alternative info aggregates. This is what big business is always pushed for when they lobby or posture for regulation of their own industry. It's never for the benefit of the consumer. It's always for the benefit of the existing monopoly. To head that off, the consumer needs to counter by pressuring legislators to limit any legislation that they consider for the regulation of speech online. It should not make any entity the arbiter of what is or is not news. It should not require any professional legal assistance for the consumer to understand the law. It should not hinder the growth of new alternative or small companies. All it should do is change one thing. If a company makes a speech platform available to the general public or presents itself as an info aggregate and then uses politically targeted censorship to control what info its users can provide, promote, exchange, or access, those conditions make the company a political organization engaging in political advertising and therefore subject to existing regulations on such orgs, including public disclosure requirements. It should only apply to the company's censorship of users, not to any presence or preponderance of user political speech. No exemptions. That should address the problem without interfering with competition from smaller social media, search engines, or other public use media, and without hindering public political speech.
To be quite frank, the laws already exist today. The Sherman Act, as I mentioned, existed since 1890. It is basically an anti-collusion tool. And given the activity today, I know I said this before, but it's worth repeating. Given the activity on Monday with InfoWars. There is a good argument to be made that these industries are colluding together on behalf of the mainstream media news networks, such as CNN, ABC, CBS, and some of the other YouTube outlets like the Young Turks. There's going to be issues amongst all of them with their rhetoric regarding this. And it's, to be quite frank, it's the idea of the slippery slope also applies. If Alex Jones goes, who the fuck is next?
Yeah. Right. And Gregory Spillane says, sound the fan alarm, LOL. They're making moves, 1 by Google, 2 by Zuckerberg. I agree. And
definitely.
So with that, I think that since we're 40 minutes past,
Jesus.
I would just say, please, share this with as many people as you can. Get this in front of them, because apparently we're the target now too. This is unconscionable. There's no way that this is just a glitch when we're discussing sensitive issues like this. Danielle says, mainstream media. I agree. Fuck the mainstream media, and we'll end them from the inside out. We'll rot them like a corpse.
I argue people should start looking at ways to, like, if you're a lawyer, start looking at offering libel case coverage and things, because that's going to really kick off soon if these companies aren't careful. Right,
yeah. And to anybody out there, we hope you have a bad morning and a bad rest of your day, remembering that the same corporations you might support by doing what you do are the same corporations that are slowly choking you from the inside. And I would advise everybody to understand their power and to use as much of that power as possible.
Yep, people don't know their true power. And if you vote with your feet and your bandwidth, these companies can learn very quickly.
Right. Yeah. So with that being said, bad morning to y'all. Smash the state and fuck the system.
Have a bad morning, everybody.
And eat my ass, YouTube. I know you're listening. Fuck you.